Hello, everybody. And the topic of my presentation today is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary work with applied behavior analysts. Applied behavior analysts, and in particular in the context of autism treatment, have to interact with a wide multidisciplinary community. And in this slide, you have just an impression of how complex that community might be. In orange, you have the tasks or the treatment components or elements of intervention, and then in purple, you can see the various professions involved in the various aspects of intervention. So how do these people interact? I mean, they often know very little about each other, and we are really not trained to interact effectively with other professions. So what I would like to do in this presentation is try to look into how this interaction among professions can be done, and what can we learn about it. And in this aim of trying to understand how professions can interact effectively, the one important issue that comes to bear is the role of expertise diversity, and how expertise diversity improves effectiveness and performance of multidisciplinary teams. And this is a key factor. But interestingly, very few behavior analysts or psychologists, for that matter, have looked into it. You would need to look into the management and the business literature to get an idea of how expertise diversity has an impact in how people work together. And of course, when we talk about multidisciplinary work, the general consensus is that it's something good, it's something positive, because if you put together people from different backgrounds, you're more likely to capture the various facets of a complex issue, and you would be more likely to come up with a more comprehensive plan. At least that's the assumption when multidisciplinary teams are put together. However, when you look at the data, the reality is quite different. In fact, a number of studies suggest that the diversity that you put into a team has actually no impact on team performance. So that's a little disappointing. And of course, this comes from the management and business literature. And so what we need to know is under what circumstances a multidisciplinary team actually adds value or increases effectiveness. So this study here gives us an indication of what might we do to increase effectiveness in multidisciplinary teams. This is a study done with engineers and oil extraction workers from a variety of backgrounds, and they look at a very large sample. And as you can see in the red line, the correlation was actually 0 between expertise diversity and other outcomes like team performance or team performance in the right and learning behaviors in the left. By learning behavior, they meant effective communication within team members. And one factor that seemed to be critical in improving both communication and team performance in the face of increasing expertise diversity was what they call increased team identification, which essentially meant that the group got along together and the group had an emotional involvement with one another. So this seemed to be a key factor. You really need to work into the team members knowing each other, having a common language, and being able to communicate effectively if you want expertise diversity to actually have an impact in performance. So expertise, diversity, and multidisciplinary work would only be beneficial under very specific set of circumstances. One of these is making sure that the group has a language that they can share and that they get along well and that they know each other personally and such. There are other factors. For example, it is known that only in complex decision-making and non-routine environments, expertise diversity actually adds value. In more routine sort of decision-making situations, adding a very various background in a team actually doesn't make a difference. So we really need to be aware of these factors if we want to work effectively with people with different backgrounds. But what are the main styles of interaction when you put people of various professional backgrounds together? And I would like to characterize what are the general styles of interaction among professions and then provide an example on how behavior analysts can illustrate that style of interaction. So one style of interaction would be multidisciplinary work. So multidisciplinary means that you have different aspects of a problem that need to be addressed by different people that have expertise in those various aspects. So this allows to address more complex problems. Another style of interaction would be interdisciplinarity. And here you have a new problem that needs to be addressed by people from various backgrounds, and this potentially can lead to new fields. And finally, you have cross-disciplinary work, which essentially involves translating or expressing the knowledge in a field in terms of the concepts or knowledge in another field. And so I'll try to provide an example of each one of these styles and see how behavior analysis can contribute or can help. So let's start with a multidisciplinary example. And I'll bring an example from a recent study that we did, and we had a request from neuroscientists that wanted to perform neuroimaging scans with children with ASD. And of course, this was very hard to accomplish because the children wouldn't stay still in the scanner, of course. So we developed an intervention to train steadiness so the children could remain still for the duration of the scan. So this is a typical multidisciplinary sort of situation in which you have the doctors that were running the medical diagnosis, and then they needed a behavioral service, and then they seek behavior analysts, and we did the work, and everybody was happy. So in this particular case, this is an environment where the children needed to be exposed to eventually, so we developed a simulation environment with a fake scanner, and we had a number of steps, and the children were gradually exposed, through a procedure called stimulus fading to the scanning environment. Then we applied what we call a differential reinforcement procedure, in which you reward, if you wish, a gradually longer periods of time of steadiness in the scanner. And we use another set of reinforcement or reward-based strategies. So very quickly, you have this graph shows how the intervention progressed over time. The blue line shows level of head movement over time over the course of the intervention. And you have examples from 2 cases in this slide and show how the movement was gradually decreased, was easier for these 2 clients, more challenging in these other 2 clients, but they eventually reached mastery. And here you have data from the actual scans that was collected. And you can see that the level of movement, this is just a data sample, was within the range of acceptable values to conduct a successful scan. So some conclusions of multidisciplinary work done in settings such as this. You have really a potential for success because the roles, the professional roles are really very well defined. There is minimal communication was needed across professions, and the roles and the function were very clearly distinguishable between, in this case, neuroscientists and behavior analysts. Let's see another example, in this case, an interdisciplinary interaction. And remember here, what we are trying to do, we have a new problem, and we have people from different backgrounds that can interact together and try to solve the problem. So the example I bring for this type of interaction has to do with a project that we did in Canada a few years ago, where we got federal funding to develop evidence-based strategies to help special education teachers to fill their knowledge needs in their work setting. So we put together a large group of people from different backgrounds, and you have in the slide the backgrounds involved, people, behavior analysts, school psychologists, people from nursing, special education teachers, education administrators, and people with a background in human ecology or documentation on librarians. And what we tried to do was to address requests that teachers had or needs that they had for training. So the interdisciplinary field here is what is called knowledge translation. We wanted to translate evidence and science from various fields to try to solve a practical problem or a demand. So how this worked, we had a group of special education teachers surveyed and tell us what their needs were, and then we ranked those needs and tried to address them one by one. So, for example, you have the first two items, so the items that were ranked the highest in this survey. For example, they needed strategies to prolong engagement in enjoyable activities. That was their primary request. The second, they wanted to have a basic understanding of the effect of psychotropics on routines and management of the children and actually the adults with disabilities that they work with too. So what we found, or what I found during this experience, is that the truly interdisciplinary work was hard to come by. What we experienced is that people from specific backgrounds tended to seek specific areas or specific demands. So for example, in the first item, the behavior analysts seemed to be the ones that found that request as a target of opportunity, and we created a series of materials on preference assessments and strategies to prolong engagement in various tasks. And the other fields involved in this interdisciplinary team didn't really have a lot to contribute to that item. However, on the second item in the example of the slide, people from a nursing background seem to be more able to make contributions. So what started as an interdisciplinary team ended up being a multidisciplinary team, in that we had difficulties on really making joint contributions to specific issues, but we rather were able to make a contribution in specific areas that had, that for whatever reason, they were more compatible with our training. So in the case of the development of strategies to promote engagement and prolong interaction with activities, we developed a clinical guide for teachers that they could use. So this is just I'm not going to go into the detail, but essentially we had a decision-making tree that they could go through, and depending on the characteristics of the client, they were led to various strategies to assess items and activities that were the most likely to promote engagement and prolonged engagement with activities with their children and students. And we're actually in the process of transferring that system into a smartphone application. So there were a number of process issues, if you wish. It was hard to communicate because there were many people involved in this team, and trying to understand one another took a lot of time. People tend to use different terms for the same things, like some people would talk about competencies, others would talk about abilities, others would talk about behaviors. And sometimes it was hard to use terminology effectively. So as I said, something that started to be interdisciplinary in nature and that being a more sort of multidisciplinary approach, which I think is more practical. It's better to have a clear mindset in terms of what a professional can do and try to have those roles well defined when you work in a multidisciplinary team. So the final style of interaction is cross-disciplinary work, as I said before. And the example here has to do with a study that we did, that we tried to conceptualize the effect of pharmacological treatment in terms of behavioral principles. And of course, it's well known, and Dr. Rudinger was discussing it before, that people with ASD and people with intellectual disability are often under prescriptions, and according to the epidemiological studies available, around 60%, around 35% are under some kind of medication, but that figure goes up to 80% if they have a comorbid psychiatric condition, and or if they are adolescent, the figure is much higher. So the range of medications that they could be under are quite varied, but antipsychotics and antidepressants and mood stabilizers are the ones that are the more frequently prescribed, as you can see in the graph. So what we wanted to see was how can we understand the effect of medication from a behavioral perspective? And remember that the cross-disciplinary work requires that you take the evidence and the concepts and processes from a discipline, try to translate it into a behavioral language. So the first thing that we did was try to characterize the effect of medication using the methods that behavior analysts use. So in randomized controlled trial literature, the effect of antipsychotics, for example, is often characterized by way of proxy-reported questionnaires. So these are not direct observation-based measures. So we wanted to confirm that these medications were actually having an effect by using direct observation. So what you have in this graph, and again, I don't want to go into the details, is if the general effect of medication in children with autism and intellectual disability was actually clinically significant. So these data here are based on a reanalysis on a large review of 37 cases, and the measure was actually observation. So we actually observed, or the authors that did the original studies observed and measured the behavior directly. And the lower the data point, or the extent to which the data points are below 0, suggests that the medication was effective in reducing the levels of problem behavior in this case, and you have a data point for each case that was analyzed. So in gray, you can see the cases that had negligible effects or even counteractive effects, in that the behavior worsened as a consequence of being exposed to medication. So interestingly, only about 40% of clients, at least based on this incidental sample of clients, actually experience improvement as a consequence of being exposed to medication. And as behavior analysts, we are primarily interested in the function of behavior, why people do what they do, what's the motivation for behavior. And you may know that we have systematic procedures and methods to identify the motivation of behavior. So, and we call those procedures functional assessment or functional analysis. So what we did in this follow-up extension analysis was to conduct a functional analysis of problem behavior of children that were exposed to a variety of medications. So, for example, in the graph here, you can see that individuals exposed to a particular condition that we call demand showed the greatest amount of behavior. That suggests that the behavior is being caused by avoiding certain unpreferred tasks or certain unpreferred instructions or requests from caregivers or teachers. And we were able, over an extended period of time, to follow up these behaviors over time, and during periods under which the client was receiving various doses of medication. So, for example, in this client, what we saw is that when the risperidone in this case was lowered, the functional analysis was less distinct. The motivation of the behavior became less clear or less predictable. You can see that in the central part of the graph. For this other client here, on the other hand, when the medication was lowered, and you can see that again in the central part of the graph, we saw a general reduction of behavior, and the function of the behavior was no longer evident. In the third graph here, we saw that when the medication was lowered, the behavior essentially disappeared, so the function of the behavior or the motivation of problem behavior was no longer evident. So this study attempts just to provide you an example of how behavior analysis can use its methods to try to understand the effects of other interventions or other therapies, in this case pharmacological intervention. And the way in which we did that was to use functional analysis in this case and other behavioral methods to try to understand how a pharmacodynamic effect actually had an impact in behavior function, which is what we are interested in as behavior analysts, because we know that if we design interventions that are consistent with the function of the behavior, we're way more likely to be effective. So interesting conclusions that we came up with as a result of this study, and I've just shown you a little glimpses of this program of research, is that the function or the motivation of problem behavior is rarely changed as a consequence of being exposed to pharmacological psychotropic drugs. We actually only documented one true case in which the function of the behavior radically changed as a consequence of being exposed to a medication. In 50% of the cases, there was a change in frequency of the behavior. And again, frequency of observed behavior is something that is a truly behavior analytic measure. So we try to see how pharmacological treatment had an impact in a dimension of behavior that we would typically look at. And what we saw is that only in around 50% of the cases we were able to observe a real change in the behavior as we observed it. We saw that in the few cases that behavior function was documented, or change of behavior motivation was documented, it usually had to do with higher levels of escape-maintain problem behavior, or behavior that is motivated by avoiding unpreferred activities or task demands, and as a consequence of higher levels of risperidone, this typical antipsychotic. And essentially, the conclusion of this line of work was that it is possible to use behavior analysis to try to translate what is done in other disciplines to our advantage, try to understand it better, and try to be more effective clinicians based on that understanding. And of course, this new knowledge also requires a new style of interaction with other professions, in this case, with prescribing professionals. So when we know that there is a level of interference or maybe a level of synergy, and the style of those interferences and those synergies between interventions, then we are in a situation where we can have a conversation with maybe Dr. Rodinger here and try to develop more effective strategies for the advantage of our clients. And I have a second example of what could be cross-disciplinary work, and that has to do more with my background as clinical psychologist. And I wanted to give you, different examples of different styles of multidisciplinary work, but given that I think I'm here in a capacity of clinical psychologist, I would also give some time to how behavior analysis can interact with clinical psychology. And again, here I think we are in a cross-disciplinary arena in which we need to know more about how behavioral mechanisms and behavioral processes apply to what clinical psychologists do in their practice. And of course, we also need to know more of the type of work that they do so we can actually develop effective strategies to communicate between behavior analysts and clinical psychologists. But first of all, we need to be aware of the differences in the style and differences in the way work is conducted in either field. So for example, the setting is quite different across the two professions. Clinical psychologists typically work in a little consult or in a little clinic, and while behavior analysts often work in the field, in the classrooms, in the homes, in the residential setting. So the settings are actually quite different. The time frame and the intensity of the intervention is also quite different. Behavior analysts often engage in very intense one-to-one interventions. Sometimes those interventions may last for a long time, if we are talking about early intensive behavioral intervention, for example. And on the other hand, clinical psychologists may engage in long-term interventions, but they are rarely as intense in terms of the number of hours of work involved per week, for example, less intense relative to what it would be an average behavior analytic intervention. Also, the way in which contextual factors are analyzed is very different. I mean, we as behavior analysts tend to look at very specific variables, very specific determinants in the environment. For example, how is the caregivers, how is the teacher, how is the parents, how are they interacting with their child? Is their interaction leading to reinforcement, to a skill acquisition or not? So we look at very specific variables in the environment. However, a clinical psychologist may have a more holistic approach to clinical problems, looking at a very diverse set of issues that could be, marital relationships, professional relationships at work, emotional factors, physiological factors, and so forth. So the breadth of their assessment is much wider in that respect. So we need to be mindful of that when we try to establish a communication. Also, the nature or the channel of their intervention is quite different. A clinical psychologist would typically mediate everything that they do through language. It's what is called talk psychotherapy. Everything that they do has to do with verbal communication. So they rarely interact directly with the physical and social environment of the client. While in the case of behavior analysts, we are actually at the other end of this dimension. I was talking with a behavior analyst here last night, and one of her concerns was that we need to remove language. That's why we are better off by using clickers sometimes, because language often adds a lot of confusion when you're trying to deliver a contingency, for example, or where you're trying to deliver a reward. Language sometimes is too complex, takes time, and is definitely a completely different channel of delivering an intervention relative to direct implementation of instructions, consequences, rewards, and so forth that a behavior analyst would do. The general philosophy, if you wish, of the intervention is also different. We tend to think a lot about functions as behavior analysts, why people do what they do, and if they are not doing something, what is it that you need to change to get them to do something? So our intervention is typically function-based, and that is generally not the case in clinical psychology. I'm not saying that all clinical psychology approaches are not functional, but in general, there is a preference towards a manualized intervention, a package that has multiple components, and you deliver that package when someone comes to your counsel with a particular clinical problem or a particular diagnosis. So in this respect, the philosophy of the intervention, if you wish, is quite different. Also, our data collection cultures are different. As behavior analysts, as I was discussing before, we tend to pay a lot of attention to direct observation of behavior and data collection. We collect typically information on every bit of intervention that we do, every trial that we deliver, every reward that we present. If we're doing it right, we are collecting some kind of data on that micro component of an intervention. By contrast, a clinical psychologist may use a lot of interviews, sometimes questionnaires. The frequency of data collection may be much more delayed. So also the data collection culture is quite different across the two disciplines. However, these two professions are bound to interact with one another. There are a lot of situations in which a behavior analyst will have to interact with a clinical psychologist. In the case of autism treatment, a clinical psychologist may be involved in resource allocation or finding evidence-based interventions that the families could resource to. It could also be involved in monitoring progress over time, for example, by administering standardized assessments. And a clinical psychologist may also be involved with other clinical problems that families typically have. And we know also well that families do have problems of a wide variety when they have a kid with ASD in the family. And although not to be forgotten, the main contributor to the parents' stress is actually the severity of ASD in their child. So, of course, the work of the behavior analyst as a specialist in behavior will have an impact in the quality of life of the parents too. So in all these activities, and these are just a few examples, the two professions are going to have to interact. So we really need to develop a skill to communicate with each other effectively. And I think there is potential for that. In fact, the two professions do have things in common. I've mentioned things that are different across the two professions, but there are also a number of factors that suggest that the two professions can communicate, in fact, effectively. And some of those factors are summarized in the slide. So, for example, both clinical psychology and behavior analysis have a common history. And in fact, I don't know if that's the case in Northern Ireland, but across the world, behavior analysts are typically trained or come from a psychological background, and still, I think now it's less than 50%, but about 50% of approved course sequences that people that want to become behavior analysts are actually housed in psychology schools. Both professions have an interest in human behavior, and of course we may not agree in what a behavior is, but behavior is, according to us behavior analysts, a behavior is essentially everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think, everything that we feel. So, of course, the two professions have the same interest in terms of their subject of study. Both professions have an interest in assessment and systematic methods of assessment and treatment. Both professions are interested in evidence-based interventions, and both professions actually use similar interventions at times. So Dr. Radinger was mentioning before exposure with response prevention, and I could add also systematic desensitization. Those are interventions that have a huge behavioral component to them, and behavioral analysts use them often, although they don't call them that way. They call them stimulus fading sometimes. So we use different terms to very similar interventions. So for example, in this slide here, this is a study published some years ago in which the authors tried to reduce problem behavior, a case of self-injury, that seemed to be prompted by level of environmental noise in a child with ASD. So what they did is to expose the child to progressively longer periods of noise, and that's what you have in the blue line in the graph. And when there was no behavior over X number of sessions under that level of noise, then they increased the level of exposure to noise, and then they did that progressively until the level of noise was equivalent to what the child might be exposed in the natural environment. So we do use similar mechanisms and similar strategies to change behavior, although often we may call them in different ways. And as behavior analysts, we know that behavior principles are the same principles throughout all kinds of behavior. I mean, we might work primarily with people with intellectual disability or autism or dementia, people with brain injury or whatever, but we know that all kinds of behavior, from self-injury to complex thought and cognitive behavior, are all changed and established by the same principles. And a way to sort of get an idea of how general and pervasive behavior principles are might be to see how they apply to complex behaviors, as thinking or imagining or feeling. But another way to answer the same question might be to look back, look at very simple behaviors in very simple organisms and see if the same principles apply, because that provides us with an indication of how pervasive behavioral principles are. And you have an example of that in this video. Something's going to happen. It's not going to happen. Sorry, it seems that my computer has crashed. Okay, here we go. So what you see there is a fly engaging in operant behavior, pulling a little lever and getting his little reward. Such a simple principle that governs our lives. And what evolutionary biologists can tell us is that operant behavior can be traced back to arthropods and to mollusks and to animals that are so diverse that they were actually differentiated over 350 million years ago over the evolution of the species. So of course we are talking about principles here that are pervasive, that were established very early on in the evolution of the species, and they apply throughout. So are behavior principles applicable to clinical interaction, to the work that clinical psychologists do? Well, behavioral analysts always have had a hunch that that was the case, but now these behavior principles are increasingly well documented in the clinical practice in clinical psychology. So for example, this is a study that we did a few years ago. I'm not going to go into the detail, but essentially we conducted a wide, what we call descriptive analysis, in which we code the various behaviors that therapists engage in during clinical interaction. These were cognitive therapists. And we use a very comprehensive classification system, and we observe the frequency of those verbal categories of interaction between therapist and client, and we found that a high percentage of the verbal interactions were compatible with very restrictive and operationally defined definitions or conceptualization of discrimination, for example, or reinforcement, which are, as you may know, very basic behavioral principles. So, will the two disciplines actually merge in the future? Well, we really don't know, but it's a matter of getting further into this trend of researching how behavioral principles are relevant in clinical interaction, to clinical interaction in clinical psychology settings. And there are aspects of clinical psychology work that definitely differ from what a behavior analyst would typically do. And for example, we tend to use very intensive approaches to teaching and learning. And behavior analysts and clinical psychologists who use more efficient language-mediated approaches like instructions and modeling and verbal descriptions and such. So we need to know more about how those language-mediated learning strategies work in order to create this groundwork that potentially could lead to some style of merging of the two disciplines sometime in the distant future. And of course, some clinical psychologists already use behavioral principles as part of their work, and the range of populations that behavior analysts can reach with their services is ever expanding. So some intriguing conclusions about the interaction between psychology and behavior analysis. The two professions are bound to interact frequently because we do provide various aspects of services to the same population, so it is important that we develop a skill to be able to communicate effectively. And we do share a set of common values that have to do with evidence-based interventions, data-driven decision-making. We have a common history, so we do really have the basis to have an effective communication. And effective interventions for clinical problem and that were typically within the realm of clinical psychology alone are increasingly getting closer to the behavior analysis as a field. And I'm part of the Behavior Analysis Certification Board, and if you look at the documents and the standards that we produce, you would rarely see the word autism or the word intellectual disability. I mean, we do not want to be limited to a particular clinical population. I mean, the plan is that the field expands gradually because our interest is all human behavior and not a set of human behaviors in a particular population, although I know that the main interest of this conference is of course, autism. So, in summary, there is a potential for mutual understanding and even a trend towards merging between the two fields at some point in the distant future. So, some summary and recommendations to wrap up my presentation. The interaction between disciplines can take many forms, and 3 of those styles are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary interactions. And behavior analysis can be effective in all of these styles, and I try to provide an example of each of them. It is important that when we are trying to increase multidisciplinary work effectiveness, that we take into account factors like the level of communication and the involvement of the individual members of the team have, because we know that that's key for expertise diversity to actually have an impact in team performance. The behavior analysis and classical clinical psychology differ in numerous aspects, including setting, assessment model, approach to database decision making, but they share a set of core values. So that should facilitate multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary interaction and work if we're mindful of the factors, or some of the factors that I mentioned. And finally, behavior analysis is engaged in the experimental analysis of clinical phenomena of increasing diversity. So just to finish with this quotation of John Stuart Mill, it is hardly possible to overrate the value of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Such communication has always been one of the primary sources of progress. Thank you.